the last week of March, in the year 1887, a woman rode south out of Trinidad, Colorado, on the seat of a spring wagon, with a small japanned tin box balanced on her knees and a sentence in her mouth that she had carried 900 miles without once setting it down. Her name was Miriam Hale. She was 28 years old, slim and upright, narrow through the shoulder, with a pale, fine-boned face, a scatter of freckles across the bridge of her nose, dark chestnut hair parted in the center and pinned in a smooth, low knot, and steady gray eyes behind small steel-rimmed spectacles that she took off and polished whenever she needed a moment to think. She wore a plain, high-collared, slate-blue cotton traveling dress, with a fitted bodice and a long skirt gone shiny at the seat from years of sitting on a clerk's stool, a threadbare black wool shawl, black button boots mended at both heels, and gray cotton gloves that hid what she could not hide when she took them off, which was that the first and second fingers of her right hand were stained a permanent blue-black along the sides, the way a man's palm goes yellow from tobacco and never comes clean again. Ink had been in her skin since she was 11 years old. Everything else she owned in the world rode behind her in a rope-bound trunk: 3 dresses, a Bible with her mother's hand in the front of it, a mourning brooch, and 11 books, 9 of which had been her father's. The tin box on her knees held 4 steel pens, 2 bottles of ink packed in sawdust, a bone-handled penknife, a brass rule, and a folding pair of scissors, and she had not let it out of her hands since St. Louis. Not on the train, not in the eating houses, not when a kind woman in the Kansas car had offered to hold it while she slept. The country she was riding into did not look like any country she had imagined from a letter. She had expected, in a vague and citified way, either mountains or desert, and this was neither. It was a wide, dry, rolling grass country the color of a lion, cut open here and there by low red rock canyons where the Purgatoire River ran hidden in a green line of leafless cottonwood, and away to the west stood 2 blue peaks with old snow still on their shoulders, so far off and so pale that they might have been painted on the sky by somebody who had run short of paint. There were no fences to speak of. There were no trees except where there was water. The road was 2 ruts and a middle of dry grass, and it went on ahead of them, over one long swell and down and up the next until it disappeared into the shimmer without ever once having passed a house. The wind came steadily out of the southwest and smelled of dust and juniper, and something faintly sweet that she learned later was the last of the winter sage. The boy driving her was 17 and could not have kept quiet if a doctor had ordered it. His name was Wesley Tunstall, called Wes by everyone including himself, and he had a long neck, a sunburned nose, a hat 2 sizes too large that he had bought that way on purpose, and an opinion about everything within 40 miles. He told her that the Rennick place ran on the Mesa side of the river and had been there since '69, and that the old man, meaning Mr. Rennick's father, had come up from Texas behind a trail herd with $11 and a mule, and had put together 31 sections before he died, and that the old man had never in his life written down a single number because he carried them all in his head, which Wes plainly considered a magnificent achievement and which made Miriam Hale close her eyes for a moment, the way another woman might on being told that a man had crossed a river on rotten ice. He told her the mesa held snow in the shady breaks until May. He told her that Doa Refugia made the bread and that a person had not eaten bread until then. He told her the outfit shipped in October and that last October they had sent 5 carloads of beef steers to Kansas City and got back a piece of paper that Mr. Rennick had looked at a long while and then put in a trunk. He told her that everybody in the country knew Mr. Rennick had sent off for a wife, and that Mr. Rennick had told nobody at all, and that both of those things were true at the same time, which was the way of the country. Then he went red to the ears at what he had said, and slapped the lines and talked for 2 miles about a dog. Miriam let him talk. She was grateful for it, because it kept her from rehearsing, and she had rehearsed enough. In the 11 weeks of letters that had crossed between Trinidad and St. Louis, she had been honest about a great many things and silent about 2, and it was the 2 silences that sat in her chest now like swallowed stones. She had told him she was 28 and that both her parents were dead. She had told him that her father, Aaron Hale, had kept a small counting room on Locust Street and had done the books for a wholesale grocer, 2 hardware firms and a coal yard, and that she had sat at his elbow from the age of 11 and had done all 4 sets herself from the age of 19. She had told him that when her father died in the 2nd week of January, the grocer had come around within 4 days, had thanked her very kindly, had taken every ledger out of the room in a wheelbarrow, and had hired a man at twice her father's wage to do the work she had been doing alone for 2 years, and that the man had written to her twice in a month to ask where things were. She had told him that the rooms behind the counting room had been rented and not owned, and that after the burial and the doctor she had $91 in the world. She had not told him that she could not cook, and she had not told him that she could not ride. It sounds a small thing, laid out flat like that in a warm room with a stove in it. It did not sound small on a wagon seat in the last week of March in a grass country with no houses in it. A ranch wife cooked. Every woman she had spoken to on the train, every woman in every story anybody had ever told her about the West, cooked for 6 men, or 10 men, or 20, 3 times a day, on a stove that had to be fed, out of a cellar she had put up with her own hands. And a ranch wife rode. Miriam Hale had grown up in 3 rooms over a counting house in a city where a horse was a thing that stood between shafts and was somebody else's affair. She had been on a horse exactly twice, both times at 14, both times briefly, and the second time had ended with a broken wrist that still ached before rain, and with her father saying, in the mild and final way he said everything, that he supposed the 2 of them were meant to keep to the ground. She could make coffee. She could boil an egg. She could scorch a pan of cornmeal, and that was the whole of it. And she knew perfectly well that a man 40 miles from a town did not send away for a woman who could not cook and could not ride. She had gone over it 1,000 times between the Mississippi and the Arkansas. She could arrive and say nothing and let him find out across a week, which was what a coward would do and what a decent woman would not. She could have written it in a letter and let him withdraw the offer at a distance, which she had tried to do 4 separate times and 4 times set the pen down, because $91 had by then become 41. Or she could say it out loud, before she went through his gate, before she ate his food or slept under his roof, or cost him one thing more than the price of a ticket, and let him turn the wagon around in his own road with his own hands. That was the sentence she had carried 900 miles, and she had settled it somewhere west of Dodge City that she would say it at the gate and not 1 foot past it. They came over the last swell a little after 4 in the afternoon. The land fell away below them in long grassy shelves toward the river, and she saw the place all at once, the way you see a ship, a low white plastered adobe house with a deep shaded porch running its whole length and a shake roof gone silver, a windmill turning slow with a tail painted red, a long pole corral and a smaller round one, a plank barn, 3 cottonwoods just breaking their buds, a scatter of outbuildings, and behind it all the mesa standing up flat-topped and rust-red with its rim already in shadow. There were cattle on the shelves in dozens and dozens, red and white and dusty red, strung out grazing the new grass, and the whole of it looked so settled and so old and so much like something that had been there before she was born and would be there long after she died, that her hands went cold on the tin box. A man was sitting a horse in the road at the gate, waiting, and had evidently been waiting some while. Thomas Rennick was 38 years old, tall and broad through the shoulders and back, with weathered tan skin, dark brown hair going gray at the temples, a close-cropped beard, and calm hazel eyes with white creases fanning from the corners where the sun had never reached. He wore a sweat-marked wide-brim brown felt hat, a faded blue chambray shirt buttoned at the wrists, a worn brown leather vest, canvas trousers, scuffed high boots, and a red-brown neckerchief knotted loose. He got down off the horse when the wagon was still 100 yards out, and he took his hat off and held it, and Miriam thought, with a small painful lurch under the ribs, that a man who takes his hat off that early has been practicing too. Wes pulled up. The wind came across and turned the windmill. Down at the barn a horse called, and another answered. Before the boy could set the brake, Miriam Hale handed him the tin box, gathered her skirt, and climbed down over the wheel by herself, because she had decided in the last mile that she was not going to be handed down like freight. She came around the horses and stopped 6 feet from him in the road, on the near side of the gate, and made herself look up into his face. "You are Mr. Rennick," she said. "I am," he said. "Tom Rennick." "Ma'am." He put out his hand and then was not certain, and she shook it once, and his hand was hard all across the palm and warm, and hers was thin and cold and stained blue-black at the fingers, and she saw him see it. "Miriam Hale," she said. And then, before he could say any of the things a man says, before he could ask after the train or the weather or her trunk, before one single ordinary courteous word could be laid down between them like a plank across a hole, she said, "Mr. Rennick, I am going to say a thing to you here in the road, and I would be obliged if you would let me finish it, because if I stop, I will not start again." He put his hat back on. It seemed to help him. "All right," he said. "I cannot cook," said Miriam Hale. "I do not mean that I am a poor hand at it. I mean that I have never in my life kept a stove or put up a cellar or fed more than 2 people at a table. And if you set me to feed your outfit tomorrow morning, I would ruin your flour and waste your beef, and you would have 8 hungry men and a fool in your kitchen by noon. And I cannot ride. I have been on a horse twice. The second time I came off it and broke this wrist, and I was 14 years old, and I have not been on one since." She heard her own voice going thin and made it stop and start again lower. "I have known both of those things since your first letter, and I did not put them in mine. And that was dishonest, and I am ashamed of it, and I would rather be ashamed out here in your road than inside your gate. I have $4, and I can pay my own way back to Trinidad on the mail wagon." She stopped. She had not meant to say the part about the $4. It had come out anyway, the way the true number always does, and it hung there in the wind with the windmill turning behind it. Tom Rennick did not say anything for what felt to her like a very long time, and was in fact about the space of 6 breaths. He looked past her shoulder at the 2 blue peaks. He looked at her gloved left hand and her bare right one. Then he asked her a question she had not prepared for in 900 miles, and he asked it slowly, as though it mattered more than anything he had said all spring. "Miss Hale," he said, "those 4 sets of books, did you keep them, or did you copy them?" "I kept them," she said. "Trial balance every month and a closing every June. The coal yard carried 209 accounts on it." He nodded once, and something moved behind his face that she could not read at all, and he said, "Then Keep my books." She thought she had misheard him. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Keep my books," said Tom Rennick. "I have a cook. Doa Refugia has run that kitchen since before my wife died, and she would run me out of it with a spoon if I gave her help she never asked for. I have 11 horses and 8 men, and not one solitary thing on this place that wants another rider." He turned and looked down the shelves at the house and the barn and the long red mesa, and she saw his jaw set. "What I have got," he said, "is a trunk. It stands in the front room, and it is full of paper. Tally slips and brand receipts and account sales and letters from a bank in this town and a commission house in Kansas City, and 3 ledgers in 3 different hands, and my father's book, which is written in a shorthand he never explained to any living soul, and which I have been reading for 4 years the way a man reads a foreign language with no dictionary." He looked back at her. "In '69, my father put this outfit together out of nothing. He never wrote a number down in his life. He carried the whole of it in his head, and then in '83 his horse went off the Mesa Road with him, and every number he ever had went into the ground at the age of 61. I have run this place since on what I could remember and what I could guess, and I have got a note at the Stockmen's National in Trinidad, and the bank says one thing about what I owe and I believe another, and I cannot prove it, because I cannot read my own paper." He said all of it quite calmly, standing in the road with his hat brim moving in the wind, and then he said the rest. "Ma'am, I put that advertisement in because June is 9 years old and has been without her mother 4 years, and because that house is quiet. I will not stand here and tell you it was on account of ledgers. But I have wanted a bookkeeper on this place worse than I have wanted rain, and I have not been able to say so to a living soul in this country, because out here a man who cannot keep his own books is a man who has already begun to lose his outfit." He nodded at the gate. "So, you cannot cook, and there is a woman in that kitchen who does not want you to. You cannot ride, and there are 8 men out here who can. Can you take a trunk full of 4 years of paper and tell me the truth about where I stand?" Miriam Hale stood in the road in her mended boots, with the wind pulling at her shawl, and afterward she said that the strangest part was not the relief. The strangest part was that for the first time since the 4th day of January, when a grocer she had known since childhood wheeled her father's ledgers out into Locust Street in a barrow, somebody had asked her to do the one thing she was very good at. "Mr. Rennick," she said, and her voice was steady, "I can." "Then come through the gate," he said, and he opened it for her himself. The yard smelled of wood smoke and horses and wet stone where the tank had overflowed. A brindle dog came out from under the porch, thought about barking and did not. 3 men who had been mending a gate in the corral stopped mending it and stood in a row with their hats coming off in a ragged sequence. And Miriam Hale, who had spent her whole life being looked past, discovered that being looked at by 8 men at once was a good deal worse. Then a small figure came around the corner of the house at a dead run and stopped so hard she skidded, and that was June Rennick. She was 9, thin as a fence wire, with her father's hazel eyes and her mother's black hair cut short below the ears because there had been nobody to braid it, and she wore a boy's jacket over a faded pink dress and one stocking down. She looked at Miriam for a long silent moment with her whole soul in her face, and then she said, in the flat, carrying voice of a child who has been rehearsing too, "Can you make cake?" "No," said Miriam Hale. "Oh," said June, "I can teach you to add up any 2 numbers in your head faster than your father can find a pencil," said Miriam. June considered that. "Faster than Wes?" "Wes is not a serious rival," said Miriam. The child's whole face came open like a window. "Then you can stay," said June Rennick. and turned and ran back around the house shouting for Doa Refugia. And that was the first welcome Miriam Hale got in Colorado, and she never afterward wanted a better one. Doa Refugia Ortiz was 64 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, built like a bread oven, and she had run the kitchen of that house since 1871. She had buried a husband and 2 of 5 children, and had raised the rest and half the neighbors as well. She came out onto the porch, drying her hands on a cloth, and looked Miriam over from her hairpins to her mended boots with an expression that gave away nothing whatever, and then she said something quick in Spanish over her shoulder to the girl, and then in English, with a strong, soft accent. "You are thin. Sit down." "I cannot cook," said Miriam, because she had decided that morning to say it to everyone before anyone could find it out. Doa Refugia's eyebrows went up half an inch. "Bueno," she said. "The last one could." Later Miriam learned what that meant. 4 years before, after Ellen Rennick died, a woman had come out from Trinidad for the summer to keep house, and had cooked well, and had reorganized Doa Refugia's kitchen twice, and had left in September, and the old woman had not spoken her name since. "You will sit at that end of the table," said Doa Refugia, pointing with her chin, "and you will not touch my stove, and we will be friends until we die." And they were. Supper that night was beans cooked with red chili and cumin, beef ribs, and bread out of a beehive oven in the yard, and Miriam, who had eaten railroad food for 6 days, put away 2 helpings of everything and disgraced herself and did not care. The men ate at the long table in the L room, 8 of them, and they were as awkward and as elaborately polite as boys at a funeral. The foreman was Alonzo Sherd, called Lon, a lean, gray 50-year-old with a drooping mustache and a way of not looking at a thing he was thinking hardest about. There was Baldomero Ortiz, called Baldo, Doa Refugia's brother-in-law, who was past 60 and rode anyway. There was his nephew Toms and 2 brothers called Kirby, and a silent man named Pike, and a boy called Otis, and Wes, who talked. Somewhere in the second half of the meal, one of the Kirbys asked her, carefully, what she would be doing on the place, and the table went quiet in the way a table does when the whole outfit has been wondering the same thing for a week. "I am going to keep the books," said Miriam Hale. There was a pause. "There ain't any books," said the younger Kirby. "There is a trunk," said Miriam. "That's so," said Lon Sherd to his plate, and the whole table laughed, and the laugh had a small hard edge in it that she understood perfectly and did not resent, because it was the same laugh she had heard in the counting room whenever a woman was mentioned in connection with a column of figures. Tom Rennick did not laugh. He waited until it was over, and then said, in the level voice he used for saying that a horse would be shod on Thursday, Miss Hale kept 4 sets of books in St. Louis, one of them with 209 accounts on it. She will want the front room, and she will want quiet, and any man that has business with a tally slip will take it to her and not to me. He drank his coffee, and Lon, she'll be needing every scrap of paper that is in the bunkhouse, the office, the barn, and your saddlebags. Lon Sherd's mustache moved. Some of it's a shame to look at, he said. So is the note at the bank, said Tom Rennick. Afterward, Miriam sat on the edge of the bed in a whitewashed room with a blue-painted door, listening to the windmill and to a coyote somewhere off toward the river, and she counted out her $4 onto the quilt and looked at them for a while, and then she put them away and slept 11 hours. In the morning she saw the trunk. It was a cracked leather and oak immigrant trunk, banded with iron, standing under the front room window with a saddle blanket over it, and when Tom Rennick lifted the lid, the smell that came out was the smell of every neglected set of books she had ever been called in to save. dust and old ink and mice and the faint sweetness of mildew. It was full to the brim. There were tally slips in pencil on the backs of feed store handbills. There were brand receipts and bills of sale folded into eighths. There were account sales from the Kansas City Commission House, printed in 6 columns with a red heading, 22 of them, some still gummed shut. There were letters from the Stockman's National Bank of Trinidad in a clerk's fine copperplate. There were 3 ledgers. One, a proper double-entry book begun in 74 in a careful woman's hand and abandoned after 19 pages, which had been Ellen Rennick's. One, a Butcher's Day book in Tom's own square handwriting, honest and hopeless with whole months missing. And one, at the very bottom, wrapped in a flour sack, a fat little pocket ledger bound in black oilcloth with a leather thong around it. That was old Amos Rennick's book, and when she opened it she found 9 years of columns written in a private shorthand of initials, dashes, dots, and small drawings, with almost no words in it at all. And she stood there in the cold morning light with her spectacles pushed up on her forehead and felt something in her chest that she had not felt since she was 19 years old and had first been handed a set of books that were truly spectacularly wrong. It was not despair. It was appetite. "Well," said Tom Rennick, watching her face. "I will want a table," said Miriam Hale, "by the window, if I may, for the light. And I will want it understood by every man on this place that nothing in this trunk is to be taken out of this room without my knowing, and nothing is to be thrown away, not a scrap, not a torn corner, no matter how worthless it looks. Especially the worthless-looking ones. That's all?" "No," she said. "I will want 6 months, and I will want you to answer every question I ask, including the ones you would rather I did not ask. And I will want to know, this morning, exactly what the bank says you owe." He told her. The note stood at $6,200, secured by the deeded home place, running at 8%, renewed every year in the second week of October when the cattle money came in. The bank in Trinidad said that the last 2 renewals had been made short, that interest had been carried over unpaid, and that the arrears now stood at $1,140, and that if the October payment fell short again, the bank would not renew. The cashier was a careful, courteous man named Dorsey Pruitt, who had never once been rude to Tom Rennick in his life, and who had explained in a letter written in November that the bank's directors were not satisfied with the account. "And do you believe the arrears?" she asked. "No," said Tom Rennick, "but I have believed a great many things I could not prove, and none of them ever paid $1. Wes Tunstall and Baldo Ortiz brought in a pine table that afternoon, the one that had been in the harness room, and they set it under the front window facing the mesa, and Wes went out and came back with a chair from the bunkhouse, and then went out again and came back with a better one. Miriam Hale unpacked her tin box, set out her 4 pens and her brass rule and her ink, cut a fresh nib with the bone-handled penknife, and laid a single sheet of paper in front of her. On the top of it, she wrote the date and the words, "What is actually here." And then she began, and for the next several weeks, that room did not look like a room in a ranch house. It looked like a paper mill. She emptied the trunk 1 handful at a time and sorted it across the floor in a grid, weighing each pile with a stone from the yard, and June Rennick, who took to sitting cross-legged in the doorway, learned the piles by heart and could fetch any of them by the second week. There was a pile for anything that was a sale of cattle. There was a pile for anything that was a purchase. There was a pile for bank paper, a pile for the railroad, a pile for the commission house, a pile for wages, a pile for taxes, a pile for water and fence and freight, and one large humiliating pile marked only with a question mark, which was for the many pieces of paper that had no date on them, and which shrank month by month as she found ways to date them from the weather, the wages, or the price of nails. She wrote out a chronology first, on butcher paper pinned to the wall, 4 years long, month by month, and she filled it in with everything she could prove. Every shipment, every draft, every renewal, every calf tally, every hand hired and paid off. She discovered that she could date an undated tally slip by the handwriting of whichever man had held the pencil, because men came and went, and she made a chart of the outfit's hands by year, which she got out of Doa Refugia in one afternoon at the kitchen table, because Doa Refugia remembered every man who had ever eaten at that table and precisely how much of her bread he had taken. On the 11th day, she cracked the old man's book. It took her 11 days because she went at it the wrong way, as a cipher, and it broke open the moment she stopped and asked herself, not what does this mark mean, but what did this man care about? Amos Rennick had cared about 3 things: head, grass, and weight. Every entry in the little black book turned out to be a running count of animals by class, a note of what pasture they were on, and a weight or a price, with the initials of the man who had told him the number. The small drawings were brands, the dots were dollars, and the dashes were hundreds, and once she had that, 9 years of a dead man's mind opened in front of her like a door swinging in wind. She sat on the floor of the front room, with the little book in both hands, dust in the light, and she cried for about 90 seconds, which was more than she had cried at her own father's funeral, and then she got up and washed her face and went back to work. What was in the book was this. In the fall of 1882, 1 year before he died, Amos Rennick had counted 3,140 head on the Purgatoire Range under his own brand, and he had owed no man anything. Spring came up the shelves in the 3rd week of April, all at once. The way it does in that country, the grass turned from lion color to a green so new it looked wet. The cottonwoods along the river came into leaf in about 4 days, and the calves began to come. Miriam Hale learned the shape of the days from her window. The men rode out before light, and the sound of it was 11 shod hooves on hard ground, and then nothing. Doa Refugia's oven in the yard was fired at 4 in the morning, and the smell of bread reached the front room at 6:30. June went out to the tank with a bucket, and the windmill turned, and the dog moved from the porch to the shade of the wagon and back again as the sun came over. At 11 o'clock, Miriam stopped and drank a cup of coffee standing up and looked at the mesa, and it was never once the same color twice. She did try to be useful outside. She wants it recorded, she said later, that she tried. In the 2nd week, she went down to the corral in the early morning with her sleeves rolled and asked Lon Sherd to teach her to ride, because she had lain awake half the night deciding that a woman on a ranch who could not ride was a woman who would always be waiting on somebody. Lon Sherd, to his credit, did not laugh at her. He saddled a fat old sorrel mare named Peaches that had carried Ellen Rennick and had been carrying June for 3 years, and he held the mare's head and told Miriam exactly what to do, and Miriam got up and sat there 4 feet in the air with her heart going like a bird in a box. And the mare took 2 steps, and Miriam's hands came up of their own accord, and she said, "Stop. Please stop." They stopped. She got down. She stood holding the stirrup leather for a moment with her eyes shut, and behind her, over at the gate, the younger Kirby brother made a small sound. And it was not a cruel sound. It was the sound a man makes when a thing is funny and he is trying not to. And it went through Miriam Hale like a knife through paper. She took off her spectacles and polished them on her sleeve. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Sherd," and she walked back up to the house with her back straight, and she heard the laugh behind her get loose at last. And she went into the front room and sat down at her table and did not come out until noon. What she did in those hours, she wrote later, was the most important work she ever did in her life, and it was not with a pen. She sat and she considered the shape of her own vanity. She had come 900 miles and confessed her 2 lacks out loud in a road, and had believed she had thereby finished with them, and here she was at the first opportunity trying to buy back the good opinion of 8 men with the one currency she did not have. It was pride, and it was cheap, and it would end with her breaking the other wrist and being a burden in a house where she had promised to be a use. At noon she came out and ate her dinner and said, in front of the whole table, "Mr. Sherd, thank you for this morning. I will not be writing. I have got a thing I can do that none of you can do, and I mean to spend my hours doing it. And if any of you would care to see what it looks like, the door is open." Then she went back to the front room and left the door open, and for 3 days nobody came through it, and on the 4th day Wes Tunstall came in with his hat in his hands to ask whether she wanted the tally book from his saddlebag, which he had been keeping in it since October, and which was wet at one corner, and which turned out to be the only complete count of the fall gather that existed anywhere on earth. After that they came, not all at once, and not to be friendly at first, but because it turned out to be enormously convenient to have somebody in the house who would tell you exactly how many days you had worked, exactly what had been drawn against your wages at the store, and exactly what you were owed. Miriam paid the outfit herself on the last Saturday of April, out of a cash book she had opened, with each man signing a receipt in a ruled column, and the older Kirby, who could not write, made his mark, and then stood looking down at the page for a while, at his name in her clean, upright hand with the figures ruled off beside it, and he said, "That's the first time I ever saw my wages wrote down." "Then it is the first time you could ever prove them," said Miriam Hale. "Mr. Kirby, if a man ever tells you he has paid you and you cannot show what you were paid, you have not been paid. You have been thanked." The bank's letter came on the 2nd of May. Wes brought the mail out from the Crossroads store in his hat, and Tom Rennick read it standing in the yard, and then came into the front room and laid it on her table without a word. It was 2 pages, in the cashier's beautiful copperplate. It said that the directors of the Stockmen's National Bank of Trinidad had reviewed the account of Thomas Rennick, that the note of $6,200 would fall due on the 10th of October, that arrears of interest and unpaid balances now stood at $1,140.18, and that the bank would require the note to be met in full at maturity or would be obliged to look to the security. There was a courteous closing sentence expressing the bank's hope that the season would be a good one. Miriam read it twice. Then she took a fresh sheet and wrote at the top, 5 months. "Mr. Rennick," she said, "may I ask you a rude question?" "You may ask me anything," he said, "and stop calling me Mr. How many cattle do you believe you own?" He was quiet a moment. "About 2,200, he said. "Lon says 24. And in 82 your father counted 3,140. "It has been 4 bad years," said Tom Rennick. "The winter of 86 took beef out of this country like a scythe. Everybody lost. Some outfits north of here lost 8 in 10. I lost less than most, and I have shipped every fall to keep the interest fed. And I have bought no land, no bulls, no wagon, and no coat in 4 years. And every fall you shipped," said Miriam, "and every fall the money came back short of what you expected." He looked at her for a while. "Every fall," he said, "I have laid it to the market. Beef has been down." "Beef has been down," Miriam agreed. That is true, and it will account for a great deal, Tom. It was the first time she had used his name, and she did it without noticing, and he noticed. Give me until the end of June and I will tell you exactly what has become of every animal and every dollar that has left this place in 4 years. Not an opinion. A proof. On paper, with the other side's own writing on it, so that a man in a bank cannot make it go away by disagreeing with me. And if it turns out I am simply broke, then I will tell you that, she said, in June and in writing, and you will have 4 months to act on the truth instead of 9 days to act on a surprise. That is what books are for. Nobody ever believes it until the year they find out. So she went at it. From the 5th of May, she worked a schedule she wrote out and pinned above the table, and she held to it the way another woman holds to a church. 4 in the morning until 7, which was her best time, on reconstruction, rebuilding the 4 missing years account by account, from the outside in, using nothing that could not be proved by a piece of paper somebody else had written. Breakfast, 7 to 9, the current work, which was wages, the store account, the tax notice, the bills, the day book she now kept herself. 9 to 10, June, 10 until dinner, reconstruction again. Afternoons, correspondence, she wrote, in the first 3 weeks of May, 41 letters. She wrote to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe agent at the Trinidad Depot, a mild elderly man named Ives Bracken, and asked for copies of the waybills for every car of cattle shipped from that station in the name of Rennick since 1883, and enclosed $1 for his trouble, and got back, 18 days later, a fat envelope and a note saying no one had ever asked him for such a thing, and it had taken him a Sunday, and he had enjoyed it. She wrote to the state brand inspector at Las Animas, Mr. August Schell, for the inspection certificates on the same shipments, which recorded, by law, the number and the brands of every head loaded. She wrote to the commission house in Kansas City, Kell and Marchbank's Livestock Commission Company, in the flattest and most colorless language she could manage, requesting duplicate account sales for the seasons of 83 through 86, our file copies having been damaged, and signed it, after thinking about it for a full minute. M. Hale, bookkeeper, without any other kind of name at all. She wrote to the county clerk for the tax assessments. She wrote to the mercantile in Trinidad for a statement of the store account by year. She wrote to the Denver Stock Journal for the market quotations by week for 4 years, and got them, and pinned them on the wall beside her chronology, a long, jagged line of the price of beef going up and down like a mountain range, and June Rennick asked what it was, and Miriam said, "That is the weather, only it is made of money." And the child looked at it for a long time and said, "It rained in April 84. And Miriam said, "Yes, it did. And this says beef went to $4.10. And June Rennick, from that afternoon on, wanted to be a bookkeeper. The lessons were at 9. They had begun by accident with the child in the doorway, and inside a month they were the fixed point of the day. Miriam taught her the way her own father had taught her, which was not out of a school book. She taught her addition by making her total the wage column. She taught her subtraction with the store account. She taught her multiplication out of a table of cattle at $4.10 the hundredweight, and long division by asking her how many head 160 acres of that grass would carry. And June went out and paced off the horse pasture to find out how big an acre was, and came back with an answer that was wrong by half and an argument that was better than the answer. In May, the child could not write a legible figure. By the middle of June, she could rule a page, carry a column of 12 numbers without a slip, and had begun to say that does not balance in a tone of voice she had unmistakably learned from somebody. Tom Rennick heard her say it one evening on the porch about the number of eggs, and he went out to the barn and stood there in the dark for a while, and when he came back in, he did not say why. The envelope from Kansas City came on the 9th of June, and it was thick, and it was the beginning of the end of the matter, although nobody in that house knew it for 3 more days. Kell and Marchbanks had sent the duplicates, all 22 of them, printed on their own cream paper with the red heading and the little engraving of the stockyards at the top. And they had sent them because a request in a flat clerk's hand asking for file copies is the most ordinary letter a commission house receives in a week, and because the clerk who filled it had no reason on earth to suppose that anybody would ever lay the duplicates down beside a railroad waybill and a brand inspector's certificate and read all 3 at once. Miriam Hale laid them down beside each other on the pine table at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of June, with the window open and the light coming up gray over the mesa, and she read all 3 at once. An account sales, for those who have never had one in their hands, is the paper the commission house sends back to the rancher after it has sold his cattle at the yards. On the left it says what was received, so many head, of such a brand, in such cars, on such a date, at such a weight. On the right it says what was taken out, freight, yardage, feed, hay, water, inspection, insurance, the commission itself, and a line at the bottom marked net proceeds, which is the money the rancher actually gets, and which is the only line most men ever look at. Tom Rennick had looked at the bottom line of 22 of them across 4 years and had felt each time the particular sick-swimming feeling of a man who cannot tell whether he has been cheated or has simply been unlucky, and had put each one in the trunk. The first thing Miriam found was the weight. Cattle lose flesh on a train. Everyone in the business knows it and allows for it. And the allowance is called shrink, and it is not a charge, it is a difference. You weigh them at home, you weigh them at the yards, and the difference is the shrink, and the rancher is paid on the yard weight because that is what the buyer buys. But on 11 of the 22 account sales, beginning with the second shipment of 1884, the paper showed the cattle sold at the yard weight, and then showed below the line a deduction described as shrinkage adjustment at 0.75% of the gross charged against the proceeds. Miriam sat back. She took her spectacles off and polished them and put them on again. The cattle had already been paid for at their reduced weight. The shrink had already been suffered. And then the shrink had been charged a second time as money out of the net. It was small. On a 5-car shipment, it came to between $19 and $34. It appeared on 11 papers over 4 years. And it was, she understood at once, the sort of item that is never questioned by anybody, because it wears the clothes of a real thing. The second thing she found was worse, and she found it because of Ives Bracken's Sunday afternoon at the depot. The account sales for the shipment of the 6th of October, 1885, showed 4 cars received at Kansas City, and charged freight on 4 cars, and yardage on 192 head. The waybill from the Santa Fe at Trinidad, in the agent's own hand and stamped, showed 3 cars loaded and forwarded on the 6th of October, 1885, in the name of Rennick. The brand inspector's certificate for that date, signed by August Shell's deputy, showed 144 head inspected and loaded. There were 3 cars. Somebody in Kansas City had billed for 4 and had charged yardage and hay and water on 48 animals that had never existed, and had taken a commission on the sale of them at a price which in that week of 1885 was $29.40 a head. Miriam Hale did not move for a full minute. Then she got up quietly and shut the door of the front room, which she had never once done, and lit the lamp, although it was nearly light, and she went through every one of the 22 account sales, one at a time, against every waybill and every certificate, and she wrote down what she found in 3 columns on a long sheet, and it took her until 11 o'clock in the morning, and she did not eat. She found the car count wrong in favor of the commission house on 3 shipments out of 22. She found the head count wrong on 5. Always upward at the yard end and always downward on the proceeds end, which is a combination that cannot happen by any honest accident, because an honest error goes both ways. She found yardage and feed charged on stock the railroad's own papers said had never been loaded. She found the shrinkage adjustment on 11. She found a freight rate charged at 31.5 cents the hundredweight on shipments the Santa Fe's own tariff sheet, which Ives Bracken had also enclosed, because he was that sort of man, showed at 27.5. And she found, at the very bottom of the 4th season, 2 drafts, one for $410 and one for $625, that the account sales said had been remitted to the Stockmen's National Bank of Trinidad on the account of Thomas Rennick, and which appeared nowhere in any bank letter she had, and which she therefore ruled off in a separate box and wrote beside, in her small upright hand, "Query the bank." That was the 3rd thing, and it was the largest, and it was not the commission house's doing at all. She went to find him at 11:15. He was in the shade of the barn with Baldo Ortiz and a horse's foot in his lap, and she stood in the doorway and said, "Tom, I need you at the house, and I need Mr. Sherd, and I need you both to sit down." Lon Sherd came in off the shelf pasture with his shirt dark down the back and drank 2 dippers of water at the tank, and came in and sat on the edge of the bunkhouse chair with his hat on his knee. Tom Rennick leaned in the doorway of the front room and then thought better of it and sat down. June was sent to the kitchen and did not go, and Miriam saw her in the passage and let her stay. On the wall was the butcher paper chronology, 4 years long, filled in now in 3 inks. On the table were the 22 account sales in a stack, the waybills in another, the certificates in a third, the tariff sheet, the market quotations, the old man's black oilcloth book, and 1 single sheet of paper with nothing on it but figures. "I am going to tell you what I can prove," said Miriam Hale, "and then I am going to tell you what I believe, and I will be careful to keep the 2 apart, because in October the difference will be worth everything." She began with the grass and the head, because that was the ground under all of it. Out of Amos Rennick's book and 4 years of tally slips and West Tunstall's damp saddlebag count, she had rebuilt the herd, year by year, 3,140 head in the fall of '82. The losses of the bad winters, which were real and which she had set down at their worst. The calf crops, which had been better than Tom believed in 2 of the 4 years. The beef shipped, the strays, the deaths, the stock sold to neighbors, the 11 head the county had taken for taxes in '85. "You believe you have 2,200, she said. "Mr. Sherd believes 24. By my count you had, at the end of the branding this spring, 2,906. Lon Sherd's head came up. "That ain't possible." "It is possible if nobody has counted the whole of it in 5 years, said Miriam. "And nobody has, because the men who ride the Mesa side have never once compared their tally with the men who ride the riverside, and there is a piece of country in the middle, above the second spring, that both crews have believed for 4 years was the other crew's business. She looked at Lon Sherd without any triumph at all. Mr. Sherd, I have never seen that country. You have. I only know it exists because in the winter of 85 and again in 86 the tally slips for the Mesa crew and the river crew both begin at the second spring, and neither of them ends there. There was a silence in the room. Lon Sherd put his hat on the floor. Above the second spring, he said, and then he said a word he apologized for immediately. And then he said, "Ma'am, there is grass up in there a horse can't be found in." "Then that is the first thing," said Miriam. "You have more cattle than you think, and I would like them counted in September, by both crews together, with 2 tally books kept separately and compared at the fire. And I would like to be driven up there in a wagon to see it, because I will not put a figure in a ledger that I have not looked at with my own eyes, if there is any way to look at it." "You'd never get a wagon past the 3rd bench," said Lon Sherd. "Then I will walk from the 3rd bench," said Miriam Hale, "and I would be obliged if somebody would carry the water." Something happened in Lon Sherd's face at that. He looked at her for a good while, the way he looked at a horse he had been wrong about, and then he said, "I'll carry the water." "The second thing," said Miriam, and she laid her hand flat on the stack of cream-colored papers, "is Kansas City." She took them through it slowly, one paper at a time, laying the way bill beside the account sales and the certificate beside them both, and reading out the numbers, and letting the 2 men see for themselves that 3 is not 4. When she got to the 6th of October, 1885, Tom Rennick got up and walked to the window and stood with his back to the room, and after a moment he said, in a voice she had not heard him use, "I sat in that office in November of 85 and Marchbanks himself brought me coffee and told me the market had gone against us, and I thanked him for his trouble." "Then he was very likely telling the truth about the market," said Miriam. "The market had gone against you. Beef fell 11% that autumn, and there is nothing in the world any man can do about that." She put her finger on the paper. "This is different. This is 48 head of cattle that were never on the train, charged with hay and water and yardage and sold in a column, and a car that does not exist, charged at full freight, and a rate of 31.5 cents when the tariff is 27.5. And I want to be exact with you both, because in October exactness will be the whole of our strength. I cannot prove from this table who did it, or that it was done on purpose, or that it was done to you especially. Commission houses handle 600 cars a week, and their clerks make errors. What I can prove is the amount, and that every single error, 29 of them across 4 years, runs in the same direction." "How much?" said Lon Sherd. "On the commission house's account," said Miriam Hale, $7,283.91, of which 4,960 is the phantom head and the phantom cars. 1,042 is the freight overcharge. 286 is the double shrink. And the balance is commission and yardage taken on money that was never earned. Nobody said anything. Down at the corral a horse stamped. Doa Refugia, who had come into the passage behind June and had been standing there for 10 minutes with a cloth in her hands, said something under her breath in Spanish that was not a prayer. "And the bank?" said Tom Rennick, still at the window. "The bank," said Miriam, "is the part I do not yet understand, and it may be nothing, and it may be a great deal. There are 2 drafts, one of $410 in November of 84, and one of $625 in November of 86, which the commission house's own papers say were remitted directly to the Stockmen's National at Trinidad for the credit of your account. Your bank letters do not show them. They show, in each of those years, a renewal of the note in the second week of October and an interest carry over. If those drafts were received in November and were not credited until the following spring, or were credited to interest when they should have gone against principal, then a part of your arrears is not an arrears at all. It is a bookkeeping date. She looked up at him. I have written to the bank for a full statement of the account. If they send it, I will know by August. If they will not send it, then I will go to Trinidad in October and ask Mr. Pruitt for it across his own desk, with the commission house's remittance advices in my hand, and he will send for it himself, because no cashier in the United States will refuse a written request in front of witnesses when the other side's paper is on the table. Tom Rennick turned around. Miss Hale, he said, what do you make it altogether? If every bit of it stood up. I will not give you that figure today, said Miriam. I will give it to you when I can prove it to a stranger who does not wish to believe me. That is the only kind of figure worth having. And she did not give it. Not in June, not in July, not through all of August, though he asked her twice more, and afterward Tom Rennick said that was the moment he understood what had come through his gate. The summer of 1887 was hot and long, and the grass held, and the war Miriam Hale fought was fought entirely with postage. Kell and Marchbanks replied on the 5th of July over the signature of a Mr. Harlan Feist, their Western agent at Denver, in 3 courteous paragraphs which said that the House had examined its records, that its records were in order, that shrinkage adjustments were a customary charge in the trade, that any variance in car counts arose from the practice of consolidating small consignments in transit, and that the House had enjoyed a satisfactory relation with the Rennick outfit since 1878 and hoped to continue it. Miriam read the letter twice, and then said, aloud, to an empty room, consolidating. Then she wrote to Ives Bracken at the depot and asked whether cars of cattle from Trinidad were ever consolidated in transit, and if so, where and by whose authority, and Bracken wrote back that they were not, that stock cars went through to Kansas City on the through bill, and were not opened between La Junta and the yards except for feed and water at Emporia, and that if any car had been added to a Trinidad consignment east of La Junta, there would be a record of the junction point on the way bill copy, and there was none. She wrote to August Schell and asked whether his office kept and would certify the loading counts for those dates a second time, and Schell, who had by then formed a private opinion about the whole business, wrote out fresh certificates under his own hand and seal, and did not charge her for them. She wrote to the Santa Fe's General Freight Office at Topeka and obtained the printed tariff for the season of '85, with the rate on cattle, Trinidad to Kansas City, at 27½ cents the hundredweight, and a covering letter from a clerk confirming that no higher rate had been in force at any time that year. And on the 22nd of August she wrote the letter that finished it, though she did not know that either. She wrote to the Kansas City Live Stock Exchange, the association of the yards itself, and asked, as a bookkeeper acting for a shipper, for a copy of the yard's own receiving record for 4 particular dates, the number of cars unloaded, and the number of head weighed in the name of the consignor Rennick, as shown in the yard's scale book. It cost her $3 of her own money, which by then was more than she had, so she borrowed it out of the ranch cash book and wrote herself a receipt and signed it and put it in the box. And Tom Rennick found it there a week later and laughed until he had to sit down, and then he did not laugh, because he had seen the amount and understood what it meant that she had accounted for $3 in a matter of 9,000. The exchange answered on the 14th of September. Their scale book, kept by a weighmaster who had no connection to any commission house on earth, showed for the 6th of October, 1885, 3 cars, 144 head. In the name of Rennick, weighed in at a gross of 131,420 pounds. She pinned it beside the account sales that said 4 cars and 192 head, and she looked at the two papers together for a while. And then she went and stood on the porch in the evening and watched the light go up the mesa. And Doa Refugia came out and put a cup of coffee into her hand without being asked, and said, "You have it." "I have it," said Miriam Hale. Other things happened that summer, and they were not small, though they went into no ledger. In July, a neighbor came. Mrs. Iva Skiff was 61 and had buried her husband in April, and had come 6 miles in a buggy with a flour sack full of paper on the seat beside her, because West Tunstall had told somebody at the Crossroads store that the Rennick place had a woman in it who could read a bank letter. The two of them sat at the pine table for 5 hours. It turned out that the late Mr. Skiff had mortgaged the North Quarter twice, in 2 different years, to 2 different men, and that neither man knew about the other, and that the widow had been paying both and eating cornmeal. Miriam untangled it in 3 weeks of letters, found that one of the 2 mortgages had in fact been satisfied in 1881 and never released of record, took the discharge into Trinidad by mail to the county clerk, and got the paper filed, and Iva Skiff, who had been within 2 payments of losing her home, sat in the front room with the recorded release in her hands and could not speak. After that they came fairly steadily. A man about a water claim, a family about a father's estate, 2 brothers about a fence line, a young couple who wanted to know how much they could afford to borrow and had never once written down what they earned. Miriam charged them nothing that summer, and never once made them wait, and by September there were 11 households between the mesa and the river who would have driven off a hailstorm with their hats for Miriam Hale. In August, Tom's horse went down with him in a badger hole on the shelf pasture, and he broke his collarbone and 2 ribs, and for 19 days he could not ride, and it was those 19 days that settled the last thing that needed settling. He sat on the porch in a sling in a temper at first, and Miriam brought the day book out and set it on the little table between them and said, "You cannot ride. Neither can I. Let us find out what a ranch can be run on from a chair." And they ran it from the chair. He said what wanted doing, and she wrote it out. And the orders went out to the crews on scraps of paper in her hand. So many men to the second spring, the hay contract signed at $11 the ton, the well pipe ordered, Baldo to take the wagon for salt on Thursday, and every scrap came back at night and was pasted into the book. When he got up out of that chair, the outfit had been run for 19 days without a single thing forgotten, and Lon Sherd remarked, out at the corral, to nobody in particular, that it was the smoothest 3 weeks he could recall since old Amos died. On the 9th of September, they counted above the second spring. It took the whole outfit 3 days. Miriam went up in the wagon as far as the third bench with 2 tally books, a pencil case, a folding stool, and a canteen, and from the third bench she walked, in her mended boots and a borrowed straw hat, 1.75 miles up a stony draw, with Lon Sherd carrying the water and June Rennick running ahead and coming back like a dog. And she came out at the top on a wide green shoulder of country nobody had properly looked at in 5 years, with a spring and a cut bank and cottonwoods around it, and grass to the knee, and cattle standing in it in the shade, dozens and dozens of them, and calves with no mark on them anywhere. Miriam Hale sat down on her folding stool in the middle of that grass and put her spectacles in her lap and laughed until the tears came, and the men, who had been braced all morning for a scene of some kind, looked at each other and grinned like fools. The 2 tally books, kept separately by West Tunstall and by the older Kirby, and compared at the fire on the third night, with Miriam reading them line against line, came out at 419 head above the second spring, of which 161 were unbranded, and of which none had appeared in any count in 4 years. The whole herd, counted at last from end to end, stood at 2,988. Tom Rennick heard the figure at the fire with his arm still strapped and said nothing at all for a while. And then he said, "Ma'am, in June you told me you would not give me a figure you could not prove to a man who did not wish to believe you." "I remember," said Miriam. "Well," he said, "I did not wish to believe you, and here I am." They shipped on the 4th of October, 6 cars of beef steers out of the Trinidad pens, and Miriam Hale went in with them. She rode the 29 miles on the wagon seat beside Baldo Ortiz with the tin box on her knees, and at the loading chute she did a thing that men in that country talked about for years. She stood at the chute rail all morning with a tally book, in her slate blue dress and a white apron she had borrowed from Doa Refugia because the dust was terrible, and she counted every animal that went up the ramp herself, aloud in a clear carrying voice, and Wes Tunstall counted beside her in a second book. And at the end of each car she and Wes compared and signed and dated both books. And then she walked the length of the train and wrote down the number painted on each car. And then she went into the depot office and asked Ives Bracken to make out the waybill in her presence, and to give her a stamped copy in her hand before the cars moved, and Bracken, delighted, did it. Then she found August Schell's deputy, and got the inspection certificate copied and signed the same way. Then she walked back to the chute, where the buyer's man from the yards was standing with his hat pushed back watching her, and she said, "Sir, I have 611 head in 6 cars at a gross of 540 2,400 pounds by the pen scale here, and I have the waybill and the inspection in my bag, and I will be sending a copy of all 3 to the live stock exchange at Kansas City by tonight's mail, and I would be glad to give you a copy as well." The buyer's man looked at her a moment, and then he took his hat all the way off. "Ma'am," he said, "I have been at this 18 years, and no shipper has ever handed me that." "Then a great many of them have paid for it," said Miriam Hale, and she went to find her dinner. On the 6th of October the sheet came back from the yards, and it matched her book to the animal and to the pound. On the 8th, the draft came for the net proceeds, and there was no shrinkage adjustment on it, and the freight was at 27.5 cents, and the car count was 6. And on the 9th of October, 1887, one day before the note fell due at the Stockmen's National Bank of Trinidad, Miriam Hale sat up until 2 in the morning with a lamp and a straight edge, and made a fair copy of everything, in a bound blank book she had bought for $1.90, with every exhibit numbered and every figure carried to a total on the last page. And in the morning she put on her one good dress, and Tom Rennick hitched the buckboard. They were at the Stockmen's National Bank of Trinidad at 9 in the morning on the 10th of October. And they were not alone, because Miriam Hale had spent a part of September arranging that they would not be. Ives Bracken had walked up from the depot on his own time with the waybill file under his arm. August Schell was in town for the fall inspection, and had come because a bookkeeper had written him 3 letters in 4 months, and he wanted to see what she looked like. Mrs. Iva Skiff was there in her black bonnet, having driven in the day before and stayed at the hotel at her own expense. For no reason she would state beyond that she intended to be present. Lon Sherd stood by the door with his hat in both hands, and Miriam had asked one more, and it was the boldest thing she did in the whole business. She had written to Mr. Harlan Feist, Western agent of Kell and Marchbanks at Denver, on the 21st of September, enclosing a numbered list of 29 items, a copy of the live stock exchange scale book entry for the 6th of October, 1885, a copy of the Santa Fe tariff, and a copy of 2 certificates under the seal of the state brand inspector, and had informed him, in the same flat, colorless clerk's language she had used all along, that these papers would be laid before the Rennick Accounts bankers on the morning of the 10th of October at 9 o'clock, and that the House was welcome to be represented. Harlan Feist came. He was a heavy pink man of about 50, in a good gray suit and a watch chain, and he arrived on the evening train of the 9th, and he was in the cashier's outer office at 10 minutes to 9, and he had 2 clerks with him and a strapped case of the house's own books. Miriam Hale afterwards said she had never in her life been so frightened as she was walking up those steps, and that what carried her up them was not courage but arithmetic, because she had checked every figure 4 times, and there is a kind of peace at the bottom of that which nothing can get through. Dorsey Pruitt, cashier, was a thin, dry, courteous man of about 45 with ink on his cuff, and it should be said of him at once that he did the right thing all morning and did it without being made to. He looked at the crowd in his outer office, and he looked at Tom Rennick, and he said, "Mr. Rennick, your note falls due today." "It does," said Tom Rennick, "and I have come to pay it. But before I do, this lady has got something to lay before you, and I will ask you to hear the whole of it, because I have heard it and I could not shake one number in it, and I tried." Pruitt took them into the director's room, which had a long table and 8 chairs and a stove and a portrait of somebody's grandfather. Miriam Hale sat down at the middle of the long side and opened her tin box and set out 1 pen and laid the bound blank book in front of her, and she said, "Mr. Pruitt, I keep the books of the Rennick outfit. I have kept them since the last week of March. Before that there were no books, and that is the whole of how this happened, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. What I have here is 4 years of that outfit's business rebuilt out of other people's paper. There are 9 exhibits, and they are all copies of documents written by somebody other than me. The railroad's waybills and tariff, the state inspector's certificates, the Kansas City Live Stock Exchange's own scale book, the commission house's own account sales, the county's assessments, this bank's own letters. I have proved nothing out of my own writing. I would ask you to check any figure you like, in any order, at any point, and I would rather you check them all." She began with the commission house, because Harlan Feist was in the room and because she had decided to fight the loudest fight first. She did not accuse anybody of anything. She simply put the papers down in 3s, the way she had first put them down at 5 o'clock in the morning in June, with the light coming up over the mesa, and she read out the numbers, and the room got very quiet. Waybill, 3 cars. Certificate, 144 head. Exchange scale book, 3 cars, 144 head, 131,420 pounds. Account sales, printed on the house's own cream paper with the red heading, 4 cars, 192 head, freight on 4, hay and water and yardage on 192, commission on the whole. And then the next one, and the next, 29 items across 4 seasons, every one of them running in the same direction. When she had been going 20 minutes, Harlan Feist stopped her, and everybody in the room braced. But what he said was, "Ma'am, would you permit my clerk to see the exchange sheet?" He read it himself, holding it at arm's length. Then he opened the strapped case and had his clerk find the house's own file copy for the 6th of October, 1885, and he set them side by side, and he looked at the 2 of them for a long moment, and the color went out of his face in a way Miriam had not expected and did not enjoy. "Mr. Pruitt," he said at last, I will want the use of your telegraph office. And Mr. Rennick, I would be obliged if you would take dinner with me at noon. Then Miriam turned to the bank. This was the harder half, because the man she had to correct was sitting across from her and had the power to end the whole outfit before dinner. She did it in exactly the same voice. Mr. Pruitt, there are 2 drafts. On the 14th of November, 1884, Kell and Marchbanks remitted $410 to this bank for the credit of Thomas Rennick, and their remittance advice, which is Exhibit 6, says so. On the 19th of November, 1886, they remitted $625, and that is Exhibit 7, and Mr. Feist has just confirmed both out of his own house's book. This bank's letters to Mr. Rennick show no credit in either November. They show in each following spring a credit against interest dated in April. Between the November and the April, this bank held $1,035 of Mr. Rennick's money and charged him 8% on it. It also charged, in each of those 2 Octobers, a renewal charge which appears twice on the 86th statement, once on the 12th and once on the 22nd, in the same amount. And the arrears of $1,140.18, which this bank's letter of the 2nd of May sets against this account, are calculated upon a principle that would have been smaller by $1,035 had those 2 drafts been credited on the day they were received. She turned the page of the bound book around so that it faced him. I have set it out here in a column with dates. I make the bank's part of it $2,034.53, being the 2 drafts, the interest wrongly charged upon them, and the renewal charged twice. And I make the commission house's part of it $7,283.91, which is, in the whole, $9,318.44. She set the pen down. Mr. Pruitt, that is more than the note. Dorsey Pruitt did not say a word for the better part of 2 minutes. He read the column. He turned back and read the exhibits. He got up, went to the door, and said something to a clerk, and the clerk came back in 4 minutes with the account ledger of Thomas Rennick, and Pruitt laid it open on the table in front of everybody in the room, which he was under no obligation on earth to do, and he found the November of 1884, and he ran his finger down the page and stopped. There it is, he said, $410, received the 14th of November. Entered to suspense. He looked up, and he was pale, and he was angry, and Miriam understood that he was angry at the page and not at her. It was never taken out of suspense until the spring. Ma'am, that is our error, and it is a bad one, and the double renewal charge is another, and you are correct in every particular, and I am ashamed of this book. He closed it. The arrears are withdrawn. They were never owing. This bank will credit the $2,034.53 today as of the dates it should have been credited, and I will carry the whole matter to the directors on Thursday myself, because they ought to see what 4 years of a suspense account looks like when somebody finally reads it. Tom Rennick paid the note that morning with the October cattle money, 611 head at a fair market on an honest weight and an honest freight, and with the bank's own correction credited back. The $6,200 was paid in full, and the paper was stamped and handed across the table, and Tom Rennick, who had been carrying that note since his father went off the Mesa Road in 1883, held it in his hands for a moment, and then passed it without a word to Miriam Hale. The commission house took 9 weeks. Harlan Feist wired Kansas City from Trinidad that afternoon, and there followed an internal examination which turned up, among other things, a yardage clerk who had for 5 years been billing consolidated phantom cars against 11 different small consignors in 3 states, of whom Rennick was neither the first nor the worst used. Kell and Marchbanks paid on the 19th of December, in a draft for $7,283.91, with a letter of 2 paragraphs, the second of which said that the House had reviewed its procedure for the receiving of consignments and had adopted the practice of furnishing every shipper with the exchange scale record along with the account sales. Miriam Hale read that sentence and then read it again and then pinned it on the wall beside her chronology. And June Rennick asked what it was, and she said, "That is 11 other men in 3 states who will be paid what they are owed next fall and will never know why. What they did with the money is a matter of record at the county seat. They paid off the note. They bought the deeded section that held the second spring, which had been in a Denver estate for 6 years, and which Miriam found by writing to the clerk and asking who paid the tax on it. They put in a new windmill and a 2,000-gallon tank and fenced the shoulder above the third bench. They shipped the 161 late-branded steers the following autumn. They gave Lon Sherd a raise of $5 a month and Wes Tunstall a raise of $3 and the title of day book clerk, which he wrote out and nailed above his bunk. And on the first of the year, Miriam Hale opened a proper set of double-entry books for the Rennick outfit in a bound ledger with a marbled cover, and made the first entry on the first line of the first page, and she kept those books for 31 years. She was not the only one who kept them. By the spring of 1888, she was keeping the books of 4 other outfits between the Mesa and the river at $15 a month apiece, which she got because Dorsey Pruitt sent them to her. Having remarked to 2 directors and a stock inspector that there was a woman down on the Purgatoire who had found $9,000 in a trunk full of tally slips and had handed the bank its own error across a table without once raising her voice. She kept Iva Skiff's book for nothing until the old lady died in 1894 and got the North Quarter in her will and gave it back to the Skiff nephews and made them sign a receipt. They were married on the 27th of December, 1887, in the front room of the adobe house, with the trunk standing empty against the wall and Doa Refugia's bread on the table, and 11 households between the Mesa and the river standing in the yard in their coats. It was not a hurried thing, and it was not a business arrangement, and anybody who had watched the 2 of them on that porch through 19 days of August with a daybook on the table between them could have told you where it had got to. Tom Rennick said afterward that he had known in the road in March and had spent 9 months making sure she had not been bought. And Miriam said afterward that she had known on the 9th day of June at 5 o'clock in the morning, when she had found the thing that would save him and had wanted, before anything else, to run out to the barn and tell him. June Rennick, aged 9, was asked in November whether she had any objection to the arrangement, and she put her hands flat on the table like a cashier and said, "Then I get her all winter, not just at 9 o'clock, and that was the whole of the ceremony as far as she was concerned." Miriam Hale never learned to cook. She could, by 1890, make coffee that the outfit would drink and a passable pan of biscuits under supervision, and Doa Refugia ran that kitchen until she was 81 and then handed it to her own granddaughter and not to the mistress of the house, which everybody agreed was correct. And Miriam Hale never learned to ride. She drove a buckboard for 40 years, in a straw hat in summer and a buffalo coat in winter, and she went to Trinidad in it every second Tuesday, with a strapped case of 4 other men's ledgers on the seat beside her, and the last time she was seen driving it, she was 74 years old, and had the county's first agricultural loan committee sitting in the back. In the front room of that house, on a shelf above the pine table by the window, 2 books stood side by side for the rest of her life. One was a fat little pocket ledger bound in black oilcloth, with a leather thong around it. 9 years of a dead man's mind written in dashes and dots and small drawings of brands. Worth nothing to anybody in the world but the woman who broke its code on the 11th day. The other was a marbled ledger begun on the 1st of January, 1888. And when people asked her, as people did for years afterward, how it was that a woman who could not cook and could not ride had come out to a cattle ranch on the Purgatoire and made herself the most useful person in 300 square miles, Miriam Rennick would take off her spectacles and polish them on her sleeve, the way she did when she needed a moment, and say that she had done nothing of the kind. What she had done was to tell one man the truth about herself in a road, standing on the wrong side of his gate with $4 in her pocket, and he had listened to the whole of it without flinching, and had thought about it honestly for the space of 6 breaths, and had asked her what she could do instead of what she could not. Everything else, she said, was only addition.